Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Economic Policy Review Committee. I'm Jason Morehouse, Chair of the committee, and with me are Kate Lord-Brennan, MHK, and John Wannenberg, MHK.
Morning.
Please ensure your phones are on silent or switched off so that we do not have any interruptions. For the purpose of Hansard, I will ensure that only one person speaks at a time. Today, we're meeting with representatives of the Gambling Supervision Commission to discuss the island's gaming sector. Welcome to the oral evidence session.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are aware that there may be some sensitivity around individual cases. If we ask you something that you cannot answer in public, please feel free to say so. But first, for the benefit of Hansard, could each of you please introduce yourselves, including your title and how long you've been in post? Thank you.
So my name is Mark Rutherford. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Gambling Supervision Commission. I've worked for the Commission for 15 years. I was appointed in November 24 as the CEO.
Hello, I'm Gregory Petts. I'm Chairman of the Gambling Supervision Commission. I was appointed on the 1st of May. Prior to that, I'd spent just shy of 5 years as a Commission member.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Jim Hughes. I'm the Operations Director and the Designated Finance Officer of the Gambling Supervision Commission. I've been in post just under a year and a half.
Thank you. We'll start off with a big question. How challenging has this year been for you?
I've prepared for most of the questions. I haven't prepared for that one. There's been some incredibly challenging things facing us and the sector. I think that the most significant one is the emergence of a credible and sophisticated threat to the gambling sector, and I think the police have sort of articulated that the gambling sector has been exploited by organised crime. And since November, when I took over, we've done a number of things, and they've been important to get right. So the first thing is we've started to conduct a deep review of the risk profile on our estate, focusing on acute risks first. We've increased our interagency cooperation significantly, and in fairness, I have to give a lot of the credit to that to the Chief Constable, who really has made his assets available to us and to other agencies. That's improved our situational awareness, which in turn has informed the board's risk appetite, and so we've moved to a position now where we're starting to understand the risk on our estate in a much more holistic way. So that's been a challenge to get to there.
Thank you. In addition to working with the Chief Constable and the police, how are your relations with the FSA and the DFE with regard to moving forward and where you are?
So with the FSA, they're a fellow regulator. Relations are excellent. I regularly meet with Bettina, their chief. Just recently we put a piece of legislation through the branches, the permitted disclosures order. That gave us the ability to talk to the FSA. It gave us a legal gateway to talk to the FSA. So for example, if we have a director on our estate in a gaming company and for whatever reason we have a recourse to sanction them, we will share that information with the FSA if that person is from a regulated entity. So there's full cooperation. We're also cooperating on the development of our database system. So we share costs, we share the challenges that come with that. So yeah, for DFE we've got a slightly more arm's length relationship because they're on the promotion side of the Isle of Man, we're on the protection and safety side of the Isle of Man, and those roles don't really overlap, but there is still constructive discussion so that they could understand our risk appetite and our licensing appetite, and we can understand their problems as well.
Thank you very much. If we focus now on risk, and Mrs. Lord Brennan will lead us on this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So obviously the role of the Gambling Supervision Commission is as a regulator, but it has historically, been there as a support for industry as well as the sector has developed. I want to ask a few questions around the competitive edge for the island in the sector as the Gambling Supervision Commission sees it. Acknowledging sort of changes elsewhere and benefits of other jurisdictions. What is the Gambling Supervision Commission doing to re-establish a competitive edge against other jurisdictions?
That's not really our role. So we're in the safety business. Our job is to make sure that gambling, and particularly those entities we regulate, are meeting the expectations of Isle of Man law. Occasionally, business will come to usually DFE first and say we have a particular barrier to our competitive edge. DFE will talk to us about that, and we have a process for that. So we will look at the regulatory risks that would arise from change, and if we're satisfied we can mitigate those, then we're prepared to move legislation or change policy in order to give business that opportunity. And that's happened on a number of occasions where we've been satisfied we can mitigate the risk, or we've assessed something as having low risk, and then we've made changes that benefit industry. And while it's not our core mandate to do that, our core mandates are protection of the young and vulnerable, prevention of crime, and making sure gaming is fair. We do have subsidiary mandates which include ensuring that the Isle of Man gaming sector can compete internationally and is developed.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that's quite interesting because, of course, you acknowledge that a whole range of legislation sits under and stems from the GSC.
Sorry, I didn't catch that question.
There's a whole range of legislation that is directly linked to the GSC.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yes, we've got numerous gambling acts. And
right. So if I can perhaps put things in a slightly different way and also recognise, that part of that, would highlight that in the Commission discharging its functions in relation to gambling, part of the things that the Commission should have regard to would be, the desirability of facilitating the development of the gambling industry in the island, securing competition within that industry, and also ensuring that gambling products promoted by that industry can compete effectively throughout the world. So you'd acknowledge on that basis that the role of the regulator, is just not about the sort of safety as you've described it.
Only in the sense of that hierarchy. So we would never fulfil one of those subsidiary requirements if it would endanger one of the core requirements.
Okay, so if I'll press on that again and on the point of legislation. You clearly for companies to, they're required, and we would want them to operate within relevant law. The way relevant law is composed can have a direct impact on how companies can be licensed, and also overall how the island can be competitive. That's the background to where gaming came from. So if I can just ask then, has the GSC, with all its experience of dealing with business as a regulator and effectively overseeing operators, have you conducted a review of the Isle of Man regime versus competitor jurisdictions, from an operator's perspective, to perhaps establish, where an edge point of difference, USP, can be further developed?
No, we haven't. I'm aware that the Department for Enterprise has.
And where do you see the role of the GSC in that, with all your experience?
To receive suggestions from industry and the Department for Enterprise on changes to law that would make the Isle of Man more competitive, and to understand whether those changes can be made within our mandate to keep the sector safe for the Isle of Man and its consumers.
Okay, so you don't essentially see it as part of your role?
Well, it's part of our role to be cooperative with the DFE, but it's for the DFE to lead an initiative like that. It wouldn't be for us to be comparing ourselves to all the other jurisdictions for...
No analysis, no. You've not sort of done a review recently of the law?
Not in terms of competitiveness, no.
Okay.
We do conduct reviews against our peers, for example, in consumer protection. So we regularly attend forums of other international regulators and listen to their experiences and understand what protections they're putting in for consumers, or how they're ensuring game fairness, that sort of thing.
Okay. Would you have any comment on how the industry would fare without perhaps establishing a new USP, because obviously the sort of attractiveness of the island does very much tie in with the regulatory approach taken. Without that, it'd be very hard to attract any new operators.
Okay, I understand the question. So we recently had an applicant for an online gambling license, and they'd done a comparison of the gaming jurisdictions, and they'd chosen the Isle of Man, and they indicated their reasons why. So while that's not of direct relevance to us as a regulator, because we're more interested in have they got the capacity to comply with ILO law, we did bundle that and send that to the Department for Enterprise for consideration. So I'll give you an example. One of the things they said was that they were hoping in the future that they would be acquired by another company, and that company would only acquire them if they could demonstrate they were in a jurisdiction where compliance was taken seriously. They'd ruled out a number of competitor jurisdictions because there was no track record of enforcement, for example. So they were trading on the reputation of the Isle of Man as a place that pretty much does what it says on the tin. These are the laws, the regulator shows up in your life, make sure you adhere to them. If you get them wrong, we'll guide you into compliance, and if necessary, we'll enforce.
Yeah, and I think there is a view that a regulator cannot really act as a promoter at the same time. So there's obviously an inherent conflict there that I think most people can sort of understand. If your first job is and your statutory role is as regulator, then I think we would probably help if we could, but not to the detriment of our statutory obligations.
Yes, obviously part of the statutory obligations are, as I've stated, so the line of questioning was around whether the GSC has reviewed its own legislation to see if there were perhaps some changes that needed to be made. On the legislation, I've got two further questions in particular. Are you planning any changes to primary or secondary legislation? And would any of that relate to potentially removing a requirement to have companies have their hosting here and have other if you like solid Isle of Man presence here? Is anything like that proposal being considered?
So yes, we are contemplating a number of reforms. None of them are in the category of the interest that you're explaining. They are all designed to orient us towards the Moneyval evaluation process. They'll give us greater powers of scrutiny. They'll give us the ability to manage the end of life of a licence in a much more controlled way. The e-gaming strategy that the Department for Enterprise have recently commissioned does suggest that there are some possibilities for innovation in the regulatory space to create opportunities. I think we'll take them in exactly the same spirit as we've taken previous suggestions in the past. We'll look at them, we'll understand their feasibility and their risks, and if we think that we can implement the change to the benefit of industry without compromising our core mission, then we will.
Okay. Some people would say that at one time the GSC was appropriately light touch to be able to intervene, but also to be able to be supportive to the sector, and indeed that's how it emerged. And some would say that once light touch GSC has become perhaps overly bureaucratic, and some of the obligations it subjects licensees to, and that this is making the holding of an Isle of Man licence not sufficiently cost effective. How can the GSC address this?
So in a number of ways, and the first and most important one is being open to that criticism. So when the e-gaming strategy was being formulated, there were a series of in-camera sessions with industry, with agencies and the government, etc. And those did produce a list of things that the GSC could consider doing better, around perhaps consistency of messaging, etc. Our process has been criticised because it is still quite clunky compared to some of the newer jurisdictions, and there are reasons for that, which I could go into. But I think the main change in the space has been the change in the GSC's appetite for enforcement. So back in 2022. A report was commissioned by the government to understand where the island was in terms of its money val obligations and its obligations to the FATF. And that report made a number of significant recommendations for the GSC, one of which was to ring-fence our anti-money laundering, countering terrorist financing and proliferation assets so that they could operate independent of our general supervision. And the other was an indication that unless, when we find failures on our inspections, which we're very good at finding, unless we consider enforcement action as proportionate, then Moneyval would see that as a deficiency and a significant one. So from mid-2024 onwards, and we did significant outreach with the sector on this. We've been in the business of following up unsatisfactory inspections with enforcement action, and in some cases publishing that. So it's entirely possible that the sentiment that you're receiving is as a result of that change in approach.
No plans to address?
Oh yes, sorry. So our focus at the moment is on risk. We've got an agreement with the Department for Enterprise. They're going to do a survey of industry sentiment just to make sure that everyone's had a chance to have their say, and then we've committed to some sort of project in September to produce a roadmap of what we're going to change and when. Okay,
thank you. And my final question, Chair. The question I'll pose now, relates to sort of the past few numbers of years. What are the reasons, in the GSE's view, for the surrender of licences by major operators over the past few years?
So surrenders, there's a great variety of reasons, if I group them. So the first category is commercial. It's just not commercially viable. It's a very competitive sector, as you think. The second reason might be relocation. So it might be that a country has opened its market for licensing, so they simply shift their license to that country. It might be because as a result of our increasing risk picture, we start to ask questions and they prefer not to answer them for whatever reason, and they surrender the license. And in extremis, sometimes we will indicate to a licensee that we intend to revoke or suspend their license, and often, when I say often, they can surrender their license ahead of that revocation. So, and I think it's fair to say that there's a significant amount of licenses coming and going in any particular year. If I look at some of the statistics I brought to this hearing, so in 2015 we had 17 surrenders, 16-12, 17-6, 18-6, 10-7, 8-4, 15, 18. So there's a churn, there's a natural churn anyway, for those reasons that I've outlined.
I think there's one thing to sort of make clear as well, that the attractiveness of the Isle of Man licence historically has been diminished by the growth in other countries bringing in their own licensing regimes. I mean, the attractiveness of that licence was that it was a world-facing licence, but so many countries now have brought in their own licensing regimes, and so it's difficult to find that USP. I mean, the USP has been diminished. So that's an important factor to bear in mind, I think.
Just to add to that, the licensed sector, while it's substantial, isn't the only part of the economy that's gambling related. Our focus is on essentially consumer risk and criminality. There are unlicensed operations in the Isle of Man, some of them really quite sizable, and while they don't pay license fees, they will still have a local spend and employment.
And they're effectively operating completely legitimately outside
Absolutely.
of that framework, which is quite,
Yes.
quite fine, and is beyond the interest of the GSC. So actually, with a shrinking pool of licence holders, potentially, well, where does that leave things, either in terms of your fees or indeed of the need for the GSC as it stands? Then,
Well, so really that's the will of Tenwold. GSC was set up in 1962 to ensure that gambling was safe. At that stage it was a casino and maybe licensed betting offices. In the turn of the century that changed into telephone betting, then it turned into online gambling and smartphones, etc. I don't know what the next iteration is. We sort of regulate what we see in front of us and adapt to the risks.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a variety of national licensing models. The Isle of Man is a point of establishment, so players come from a country onto the Isle of Man server, they play the game.
Well, and the hosting issue, is also being diminished by the prevalence of the cloud. So that's not something that's within our control either. So, a lot more operators are starting to move their processing through the cloud.
I think generally speaking, less operators on the estate obviously means less licence fees, but it doesn't necessarily mean less economic activity, because depending on the quality and where those licensed operators are situated, it could mean better types of business for the Isle of Man.
it was more in connection to, obviously, if you had fewer licence holders, you would have smaller amount of income coming in. So either the setup of the GSC would have to address that. And actually, perhaps it would need to naturally shrink down if there's actually not so much activity to oversee. Obviously, if there was to be a hike in fees, because actually there was a fewer number of licensees in order to support the GSC, then that would just sort of contribute to a further spiral.
I don't disagree. We'd certainly have to talk to the Department for Enterprise to understand if that was a measure that we needed to take, what impact that would have on the sector.
With regard to the unlicensed, do you assess that risk, and is any assessment made of those companies at all by any authorities on the island?
Yes, we periodically review risk on the island. In fact, we're in the middle of a consultation at the moment with the sector to understand the facts of a particular sector that we regulate, to see if it carries broader risk or not. And rather than make the assumption it does, what I've done is I've commissioned a fact-finding exercise to understand the realities of that particular sector, and we'll react into that risk if we see risk, if it turns out it can't be mitigated or it does exist and can't be mitigated.
Is there a danger there that we're going to respond rather than be proactive with the unlicensed companies?
Sorry, I didn't catch the
With
question.
the unlicensed companies, is there a risk that we're actually going to respond rather than be proactive and make sure issues don't occur?
So maybe if I go into a little bit more detail.
Please.
Let's imagine we've got a company in the Isle of Man that produces software, and then we've got another company that sells that software on its behalf, like a reseller, and they sell it to a company that has customers. So what we want to understand is, how do we mitigate the risk that their customer could be generating the proceeds of crime, coming to the Isle of Man, coming back to the Isle of Man. And in there we need an appreciation of how far removed does that become before it becomes just a generic issue. And are there mitigations that the industry implements which we're just not aware of? So there's an example where we would explore the risks with an open mind to understand whether there's a risk or not. And then there's a discussion about if we've found risk and we think it's unmitigated, what can we do? Is that a policy discussion or is that legislation, etc.? So.
And with regard to the surrendering of licences, two areas you identify, the commercial issues and relocation. In terms of your sphere of influence in your work, it's going beyond that kind of enterprise. So do you pass those over to enterprise, or is it just dealt with as kind of from your perspective and left?
No, it's from our perspective. It's a regulatory matter. There's nothing to stop us talking to Department of Enterprise about it, but it's just not within our remit really to advise them on economic matters.
So if it continues as it is there that possibility that will be raised and then they can actually assess that more fully?
I think the strategy that they've just commissioned has highlighted a number of issues for them.
And with regard to the churn, it's something that we kind of make reference to every time you come along. You made reference previously to being kind of a healthy churn, and it is something you expect within the sector. Is that still what you're seeing within the sector?
Yes, although it's only fair to point out that so last year we had 18 surrenders, the year before 15. We're halfway through this year and we're on 16 so far. I think I mentioned at the start, since November when I took over, we've been doing a detailed risk review. That's been taking information from the FIU and most significantly from the police, because they've got access to assets and information we don't. So we pool our thoughts. Where we're finding higher risk operators, we might explore an avenue of interest to us. And in some cases, we're seeing those licenses being surrendered. In other cases, we've done an inspection and we've found significant failings. While we're in the discussion about remediation, they'll surrender the license, thinking that gets them off the hook, and it doesn't, for what it's worth.
And in terms of the process, is it done to a certain timetable, or has it been speed up because of the involvement of the police?
No, what the police give us is a greater depth of understanding. So I have to be super careful about what I say here. Yeah. But let's imagine something that they're doing over here bears on one of our licenses. They might tell us this is happening over here, and that gives us the opportunity then to look at that.
Thank you.
Can I come in, Chair? I just want to come back to some of the regulatory points. I'd made some of the points before about the GSC's role when I mentioned to you about the Commission needing to consider regulation that would be also around the desirability of facilitating the development of the gambling industry, securing competition and ensuring that gambling products are promoted and can compete effectively throughout the world. So that's actually taken from Section 5 of the Gambling Supervision Act. In terms of the regulatory objectives, it's not something that is a subsidiary objective. It's got no lesser stance than the other points in subsection 1 and 2. So is there anything that you would like to add really in terms of how the GSC is approaching its interest in, if I can put it in that way, to regulation? There's another aspect that says that in discharging its functions relating to gambling, the Commission must have regard to the need for the regulation, supervision and control of gambling to be effective, responsive to commercial developments, proportionate to the benefits which are expected to result from the imposition of any regulatory burden. And it goes on to say about also the need to use its resources in the most efficient and economic way. So there's quite a few things that are also about not being, in layman's terms, overly bureaucratic. Sure. Is there anything further you wish to add in terms of how the GSC is approaching its responsibilities as set out in law there?
Well, perhaps if I demonstrate our credentials in this area. So in 2010, there was considerable confusion within the industry about what should fall under regulation and what shouldn't. The suggestion was made by Treasury in that instance that we clarify that in regulation, so we did. We carved out those elements in the ecosystem that were of no interest to us because there was no consumer or criminal angle to it. We received a request from industry about a certain model where, as the sector, as the industry was starting to specialise into people who handle customers and people who handle games, it was apparent that the Isle of Man was lagging behind because it didn't have a licence that would allow that kind of structure. So again, we looked at the risks, considered them, considered the mitigations, and then placed that structure into law to allow the Isle of Man operators to use that model. Similarly, we had an approach from industry saying every other territory that we go into licenses software production, you don't, and it takes us a long time to try and convince bankers or software houses, etc., that the license isn't required in the Isle of Man because there's no risk to software licensing. So we brought in a regime for software licensing. So again, it's that model. We'll be responsive and sensitive to the needs of industry because we do want a modern industry. As a professional regulator, I want to get as many people under my regulations as possible because they're very strong, and consumer protection is served by having people under licensing. And in order to do that, we need a modern, fighting fit sector that's capable of competing with others. So it would be wrong to say we facilitated that in the sense of recommending it, but we've responded to those sensibly, I think.
I think it's important that it is drawn out, sort of gets back to the first question around what changes can sometimes be made or may need to be a review to get to those USPs, which may be very subtle and detailed. So thank you for answering that question.
Pleasure.
Mr. Wallenberg.
Thank you. Just a few questions. Something that Jim said, that the regulator cannot be the promoter. I agree. And then something that you said, Greg, that our USP is being diminished by other countries. So what's the action plan then? What are we going to do about that? What are your recommendations to the DFE on how to combat that?
I don't think there's a remedy for the erosion of the point of establishment model by national regulation. It's fair to say that DFE might decide to go into a particular area of the globe to market. So just as countries close, so other ones become available. But no, I mean, I don't know how to answer that really.
Yeah, I think, I mean, personally, I think what you want to avoid is a race to the bottom as far as regulatory standards go. You know, there are other regulators around the world that have opened up, and naturally that means that, you know, the international gambling model has sort of it's leveled off quite a bit. I mean, there are things maybe people could do, like bring down the fees and stuff, which might attract people, but it's more of a DFE matter as a promotion of that particular sector of the economy.
Okay. Your first statement, Mark, you said the emergence of a threat by organised crime.
Yeah.
That's not unique to ourselves, is it?
No.
And did we see that coming in any way?
It's one of the questions that's yet to be answered. I mean, ultimately, I think everyone's got a fairly legitimate question, which is how do we find ourselves in this position? If I think about it in terms of lines of defence, somebody in the Isle of Man must have first seen this, and if they did, what did they do with that? And then the next line of defence is, well, the agencies are specifically looking for this. When did one of the agencies see this, and how did that galvanise an all-island approach? And of course, in the centre as us, as the GSC. We're closest to these people, so you'd expect us to be able to see them, even if they hadn't triggered any of those other trip lines. If I think about the changes I've made to the GSC since I've taken over, I've strengthened interagency cooperation, because there does need to be a whole of government response when these things occur, because people have got access to assets and resources that we don't, but we've got access to resources and assets that they don't. We have to share. The alternative is you build a police force for every sector with all of the powers and with all the information sharing abilities of the FIU, and that'd be crazy. So interagency cooperation probably hasn't been where it's needed to be, but it is there now. And that, what the police call situational awareness, now that we can see what everyone else can see, we've got a pretty good idea of what we're facing. So yes, we're under attack, and we're taking the fight back to the enemy.
And at this point, I should declare that I'm a member of Home Affairs, just
All right, okay.
that's out. You mentioned earlier on as to how many licenses had been lost over the past few years. Do you have the corresponding figures for those new licenses?
Not to hand, but we do track that, so I can make that information available.
Thank you. That's all my questions until the next section.
Would you like to move on to the next section, Mr. Vandenberg, please?
So we're going to look at Moneyval.
Right.
What changes have been brought in legally or in guidance in preparation for Moneyval in the last 2 years, and what impact are these intended to have on regulation in practice?
So I'll answer that in a roundabout way. So our code, our money laundering code, hasn't changed since 2019. It's pretty much fit for purpose. It has been pointed out that we've got some technical deficiencies. One, for example, is that we don't have the ability to issue a financial penalty to an individual. We can only do it to companies, and our Moneyval advisors tell us that that's a deficiency that needs to be fixed. So that's going into our reforms. In terms of what Moneyval are looking for is an intelligent reaction to the problems that we've got. So you're right, the Isle of Man isn't immune to criminal interest. We've got to be able to demonstrate that we're doing something that the FATF would recognise as within their framework. So that starts with interagency cooperation. So we've moved legislation, secondary legislation, to allow it to share more widely with other government agencies in the Isle of Man. We've started to routinely reach out to other gambling regulators whenever we process an application or a change in ownership and control that bears on those those regulators as well. Some of the other reforms that we've got, which we're hoping to get in before the dissolution of Tinworld, they allow us to look more broadly at a company. So at the moment we are sort of restricted onto the licensee. We have all of our powers focused on that. It's overreach if we start looking at their sister companies or their subsidiaries, or we can look at the parent companies, or we do. The laws can be clarified so that we get that proper reach. And as I mentioned earlier, where the surrender of a license is like an avoidance tactic, at the moment we can't control that, and we'll be able to control that in a way that allows that surrender to be held in abeyance while certain things are done. So they may be AML and enforcement consequences, or it may be simply that we want confidence that all of the player balances that company has have been paid away to those players before the company then dissolves.
Okay, thank you. Do you anticipate that Moneyval will result in any recommendations or findings that could restrict the attractiveness of the island to e-gaming firms? And Greg, I'll let you answer that.
I'm afraid I have no idea. We don't know what's going to happen during the Moneyval proceedings, what they're going to find, how they're going to react. I really couldn't answer that question. I'm sorry. I don't know.
Okay, Mark?
The obvious, if one makes the assumption, no, let me reframe that. That's not the right way to put it. So our understanding from our advisors is that provided the Isle of Man reacts to the deficiencies that have been identified, then it stands a good chance of making a good fist of the Moneyval evaluation. The areas for improvement are understood. The government's Financial Crime Strategic Board meets regularly to monitor progress, and progress is being made against those requirements. So, and I think I echo Greg. I can't see the future for certain. I'm not sure. Certainly, if the Isle of Man went into special measures and wasn't able to get out of them, if it then subsequently fell into grey listing, there's mixed evidence on that, but it would almost certainly affect all sectors, including the gambling sector.
So I think the best thing we can do is get a positive Moneyval result for future business.
Without a doubt.
without stating the obvious, yeah.
Thank you. Are there concerns that preparation for Moneyval is having unintended chilling effects on legitimate compliant firms? If so, how are they being mitigated?
I don't think we expect our licensees to be legitimate compliant firms. That's the end of it. If they're legitimate and compliant, what have they got to fear? You know, since taking over as the chairman, I'd like to deliver a message to the industry, which is we are open for business and we do try to regulate fairly, and we will listen to what people have to say, but they're expected to run their businesses appropriately. And if we find otherwise, they should expect consequences from that. It's as simple as that.
Good.
And I think,
no, I'm happy with that answer.
okay.
Thank you. Have there been any recent extensions, or are there any planned, to the island's KYC, AML, or CFT requirements for the e-gaming sector, particularly in relation to factors such as client base, country of operation, or business model? Do you want me to repeat that?
No, I understand. Our guidance for the AML code is really quite extensive already. Covers a lot of that, but you'll be aware that just recently the Economic National Strategy Board of Council of Ministers issued a national risk appetite statement indicating the nature of an acute and credible risk that faces the sector, and that's been helpful in a number of different ways. It increases situational awareness. It's also you can easily predict that that's going to be part of the national risk assessment when that finally gets published. So one of the challenges that every sector is facing is reacting to the national risk assessment in sufficient time to be able to demonstrate then to Moneyval when they come that they've taken on board the national deliberations and have reacted to it. In a way, the e-gaming sector has been given a sneak preview, really. So they've got a little bit more time to react into that. And I think the other point I want to make is it must be tempting to see that Moneyval's coming and that there's suddenly a flurry of activity. But really, where we're focusing on in the GSC is to make sure that our business as usual is compliant, and Moneyval will be a helpful sort of indicator of whether we've got that right or not, but we'll still be doing that in the future, so it has to be sustainable.
Okay, good. Final question on this. How many regulators across the island have been briefed in relation to these changes and the island's broader preparations for Moneyval?
So everybody on the Financial Crime Strategic Board would be aware of the preparations and would have been prepared for questions from industry, for example. So I'd have to check, but the Financial Crime Strategic Board, and I hope I don't miss anyone out, is Customs and Immigration, is the FSA and the GSC, the police, the FIU, and Cabinet Office as coordinators. And I apologise if I've missed somebody.
Okay, did say how have the regulators...
Oh, Department of Home Affairs.
Okay, thank you.
With regard to the changes to the end of licences, how soon can you see that being applicable and in place?
we need the Viaries first to put those regulations into position. We'll be imminently opening a consultation on that for 6 weeks with industry, well, a general consultation to gather industry feedback on that and other measures. Ben's going to kill me because he did tell me recently when he was aiming for, we're hoping to get it through the branches before dissolution of Tynwald. It's an ambitious timetable, but so far so good.
I think he said he was aiming to put it into the branches in October.
October,
So there'll be a consultation over the summer recess.
Yeah. Is there anything else?
Thank you. I'm going to read a very short paragraph to you. And it's actually come from an article from effectively from Digital Isle of Man in 2003, where they're saying that Digital Isle of Man has reported the highest number of e-gaming businesses ever licensed in the Isle of Man. So that's from 2003, stated by Digital Isle of Man. And in it, in this particular article, it says, in 2001, the Isle of Man was one of the first jurisdictions in the world to introduce legislation specifically designed to benefit gambling and e-gaming firms and fully protect customers, and has established an excellent reputation as a leading regulatory jurisdiction for e-gaming, supported by robust, mature and agile licensing regimes, giving businesses prestige on the global stage. Is that a statement that you would still recognise and support?
Yep, because we often get applicants coming to us saying that they've come because they want to get an Isle of Man licence because some of the suppliers they work with hold our licence in high regard. The world has moved on a great deal since then. That's over 20 years old. But as Mark has already said, we have a good regime here. And my own personal observation on some of the changes more recently is that, perhaps some of the licences that are being surrendered for reasons that we'd be glad to see them go.
Any final closing comments on what I've just said?
It's very kind of the DfE to paint us in that light. I don't think we would seek to say that about ourselves in any sort of promotional way.
Thank you. Mr. Wanenberg, any other questions?
It's back to your point. Thank you. No, I'm satisfied.
Thank you very much. I think we've reached the end there, so we can continue in private. Thank you very much.